This is Daniel Tekanoff. In this video, we're going to look at what James Madison really thought about the U.S. Constitution. This video will be reviewing James Madison's notes from 1821, which he kept secret until after his death, about Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which he also kept secret until after his death. You can find what we are covering here in total in Volume 3 of Max Farren's The Records of the Federal Convention of 1787, pages 450 through 455. The Records of the Federal Convention is in 3 volumes, and you can all download those for free over the internet. They are out of copyright and part of the public domain. We have an earlier video on this channel showing everybody how to download the records from the original constitutional period. A foundation for this video are 2 earlier videos. The framers rushed the Article 5 Convention Clause at the end of the Constitutional Convention, gives a history of the preparation of the Constitutional Convention Clause at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and shows how it was rushed at the end. And then the video, How James Madison Covered Up a Key Defect in the U.S. Constitution, covers how in 1818 Congress had voted to open up the records of the journal from the Constitutional Convention. John Quincy Adams had asked Madison to help fill in gaps. Madison had realized there was a defect in the Constitutional Convention clause within Article 5 itself, and he then appears to make a transition, and instead of arguing that the Constitution protects equality, in this video you will see that in 1821 he writes notes that indicate that the Constitution in fact is unbalanced and has a representation system in favor of the wealthy, and he gives advice on a withering defense to protect the rights of the wealthy in an unbalanced representation system until the people finally demand change. Right at the beginning of these notes, Madison writes about himself in the third person. He's saying that his observations in a speech at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 do not convey his more full and matured view of the subject, which is subjoined, meaning that what is following explains what he really thinks about the U.S. Constitution after many years of thinking about the subject. This is after he's already served as president. And in a footnote there says that he seems to have written these notes about 1821. By reviewing these notes, we get instructions from Madison about how to amend our representation system. Madison starts his notes in 1821 saying that the right of suffrage is a fundamental article in Republican constitutions. And when you go back to the original records in Volume 1 of the Constitutional Convention, right there near the beginning, Madison was arguing that the articles regarding suffrage and representation should be placed within the Constitution itself so that neither Congress or the state legislatures can make changes. He ended up getting overruled by older delegates who argued that the state legislatures weren't going to let the Constitution go through unless you let them have power over elections and rights of representation. Back then, they were trying to maintain representation within the hands of the wealthy, as will be shown in this video. Then Madison makes a contrary concept about regulating the task of suffrage being a peculiar delicacy. If you allow the right exclusively to property, the rights of persons may be oppressed. What we see in these notes of Madison is a clear distinction in Madison's mind between those people who owned property and those people who did not. And in Madison's mind, those people who did not own property should not be represented or should not have an opportunity to take over the majority. And here he's saying that if you extend the rights of voting equally to all, the rights of property could be overruled by a majority without property. The concept of distinguishing between those with property and those without property is so strong, so ingrained in Madison's mind that he doesn't even refer to the wealthy as the wealthy. He just refers to them as property. And he's basically making the argument that people with property should have more rights than those without. You clearly see here Madison's viewpoint that there are two classes in society. There are the rights of those with property and the rights of persons. Well, persons own property or persons do not own property. So he's making a false additional category of people who own property and saying that those people should have an extra consideration in the Constitution for their protection, and that equal suffrage will not protect them, and so the suffrage must be unbalanced in favor of the wealthy. Here, Madison acknowledges that the poor should have a defense against oppression of the rich, which he says the world is filled with examples. But at the same time, Madison is attempting to set up an argument that says that the wealthy should have more representation power in the Constitution because the poor do not share with the rich the owning of wealth and property, and therefore the poor, if they should become a majority, aren't going to protect wealth and property. I don't think there's a real basis for that, but that's the way Madison thought, and that's the way many of the other founders thought as well. And here you see it, Madison saying it directly. On the other hand, the dangers to the holders of property cannot be disguised if they be undefended against a majority without property. Then in this part of Madison's notes, he's describing how the problem ultimately becomes the fact that the people in government have no sympathy or feeling of responsibility to the people. And it can be like that whether or not it's a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a popular government. In this passage, Madison makes several points. He says that the excellence of the political system of the United States arises from its distribution and organization of its powers. He also says that the government secures its dependence on the will of the nation, meaning that people are voting for the representatives. And he also argues that the U.S. Constitution provides guards against a majority oppressing a minority. Madison argues that an advantage of the United States is the distribution of landed property and the universal hope of acquiring property. In this passage, Madison makes the core of his argument that if a majority should be without landed property and without means or hopes of acquiring it, that it's a danger to the security of those with property because a majority without property can vote for property simply to be transferred. There's a little bit of a problem with the logic there because then once they acquire the property, they're going to want it to be protected afterwards, and so the logic isn't right. The other thing in this passage is that Madison admits that in our constitutional system there is still a danger from a dependence of an increasing number on the wealth of a few. In the constitutional period, Madison made promises to the people that the U.S. Constitution gave equal representation. But here, Madison is making an acknowledgement that that's not true. He says an obvious and permanent division of every people is into the owners of the soil and the other inhabitants. This becomes a basic justification for giving those with property more representational power in the constitutional system. This can go back all the way to the time of Aristotle. I call this Aristotle's illusion. What we see is that over the course of time, nature has shaped men's minds to think this way when they have power and wealth. That they come up with justifications such as that people were born to be masters and born to be slaves, and that's why slavery is justified. And that was Aristotle's argument in Politics, and that survived all the way down through the modern period. Here, Madison continues to forcefully make his point that the right of voting to those without property, if they should become a majority, would give them power over those who own property. And in Madison's mind, the people who own property haven't given consent to such a thing, and he's about to explain how the Constitution itself protects the wealthy against that happening. In this next passage, Madison then argues that based upon this theoretical possibility that you're going to have a majority of people without property voting to modify property rights of a minority, that you're going to want to modify the theory of free government, which is that everybody should have an equal vote in the government. And instead, this is justification to change that, to compromise it in order to give security to the wealthy in order to hold on to their property, even if the system goes on and creates so many poor people that there's this huge inequality that shows that the government cannot possibly be working for the common good. Madison starts with the option of confining the right of suffrage to those who own land or who own an equivalent property. And he says the objection to this is obvious, that the vital principle of free government is that those who are to be bound by the laws ought to have a voice in making them. An additional argument that Madison makes against giving the vote to only those who own land or those with wealth is that as the lawmakers become the minority, it becomes more unjust. It's interesting because he's equating the term lawmakers with the term property or the term land freeholders, those who own land. He's assuming that the lawmakers will always be those who are rich and that people without property are never even going to get representation. And so right here you can stop and say that your case has been made as to that point. And for people to claim that our system is actually equal, the burden has now shifted to them to show how the amendments, constitutional amendments, have actually corrected this problem. And I do not think they can make that case. Going on, he's saying that the regulation would be unfavorable, as it would be unjust, because what happens is you'll just get a majority without property constantly struggling against the lawmakers who are wealthy, unless it's kept down by a standing army. You could say we might even be headed in that direction right now unless we go to an Article 5 convention of the people and correct the representation system. A second option Madison discusses is confining the right to vote for one branch to the holders of property and to the other branch to those without property. For example, the Senate would be wealthy people and the House of Representatives would be the working class. Madison says this would have an aspect of equality and fairness. But Madison then argues that it wouldn't be equal or fair because the rights to be defended would be unequal. He's saying here that those who have property, the wealthy, should have more representational rights in the Constitution simply because they have property. That is not the theory of free government. It is a compromise. Madison is acknowledging it here, and he's trying to justify it, and that justification is basically an extension of Aristotle's illusion or a substitute for Aristotle's illusion. It's been shown over time to be incorrect, and we should go back and look at this. Then Madison gives the third option, which is his view of where our Constitution is at. He says you would confine the right of electing one branch to freeholders, those who own land, referring to the Senate, and allowing all others to a common right with the holders of property in electing the other branch. In other words, the House of Representatives would be a mix of the entire nation. This would give a defensive power to holders of property and to the class without property when they become a majority of electors. He's admitting here, however, that unless the workers actually become a majority of the voters, they will have participation in the public councils, but not an equal participation. And just a quick reminder, setting the stage here a little bit, from our prior video about how James Madison hid a key defect in the U.S. Constitution. About 1818, John Quincy Adams would have asked Madison for some help to fill in some gaps to prepare the journal from the Constitutional Convention. This is some, I don't know, 30 years after the convention is over. Congress votes to go ahead and open up that record, and it's incomplete. There are gaps in it, and Madison helps fill it in, but he does not disclose his warnings or George Mason's warnings to the delegate body. He keeps those warnings secret from the nation. So after that, Madison seems to make a big shift from the arguments in favor of accepting the Constitution. Originally, all of his arguments about equality seem to shift, and now he's arguing about how the nation should make a withering defense of the rights of property in the Constitution. And here he's expressly stating that since property has those who own property have a twofold stake in the nation, they should have a twofold share in the representation of the nation. In this passage, Madison seems to be referring to the Senate, and that if the public should require that they get to vote for their senators in the U.S. government, then another way to continue to protect the interests of the wealthy is to keep the extension of periods of service at 6 years in the Senate and to not add any more senators. And he's stating very clearly here that when you do these things, that will give you persons of what he's calling general respectability and of attachment to the rights of property. And what actually happens when the 17th Amendment is passed and the people end up voting for the senators is exactly what Madison is advising here. Their long 6-year terms remain, and no additional senators are added, and in fact, in 1920, no more representatives are added to the House. And Madison here confirms again his view that a longer period of service would render the body more stable and capable of stemming popular currents. He's basically saying the Senate should have these long terms so that they keep any kind of real democracy from happening. The problem really is that the workers do not have an equal representation in the system as those with property. If we could correct that, everything would work much better, I think, in the long run. Then Madison goes on, he makes one of his last points that if even these modifications should be corrected by the people, that universal suffrage and short periods of elections and what he's calling contracted spheres, which is the actual extension of the sphere of representation. So Madison is intentionally sort of confusing his language from the original period here. And he's saying if all these things should be required for each branch of the government, then those who are wealthy, when they are the minority, would still have the advantage of what he's calling the ordinary influence possessed by property. That could simply be the ownership of all of the media companies, for example, and superior information incident to those who have wealth. Obviously, those people who have wealth are able to hire people with information as well. And he's talking about a sense of justice enlightened by education that would assume that there's enough money in the educational system to enlighten people. And he talks then about maybe the biggest point, which goes back to Federalist number 10, the difficulty of combining throughout an extensive country. That is if you have an extension of the sphere of representation, whereas here he's arguing to contract the sphere of representation to protect the wealthy. And Madison goes on here basically saying that this extension of the sphere of representation concept in the U.S. Constitution distinguishes the U.S. from smaller nations where the passion of a majority under a factious leader, somebody who is pro-division, so to speak, trampling on the rights of a minor party. And here we are near the end of Madison's notes, and this is sort of his typical flourish, where he says, well, it seems indispensable that the mass of citizens should not be without a voice in making the laws which they are to obey and in choosing the magistrates who are to administer them. So he's not talking about only the legislature. He's also talking about having a voice in choosing the president. And it's not exactly clear, but I would say he's probably talking about the judges and justices as well. James Madison's 1821 notes acknowledge that the U.S. Constitution is not a democratic document, it's an aristocratic document that favors the wealthy in representational power in the Senate as well as the House. He makes 3 points about how to protect the interest of the wealthy and makes justifications for it. He wants to fight universal suffrage. He says that you want longer periods of elections to protect the interest of the wealthy. And so what you want to do is you want to do the opposite to get back to a real democratic system, meaning shorter periods of elections. And we'll talk about solutions to that both at the Senate and House level. And thirdly, he talks about contracted spheres. He's saying if you have larger districts, it protects the wealthy. So you want smaller districts, meaning extending the sphere of representation, as he said in Federalist Number 10. That was the promise he made in Federalist Number 10 of what our Constitution would be. Now in 1821, he's making these notes trying to justify why it wasn't like that. So let's go on. So applying these principles to the House of Representatives, we have a number of ideas that we can use to improve the representativeness of the House of Representatives. The first and clearest is you add more representatives. Extend the sphere of representatives, of representation. You want more representatives. That means smaller districts. That's contracting the sphere, the sort of almost secretive language that Madison was using. And what this is going to mean is going from a bicameral system to a tricameral system. I've introduced a tricameralism amendment that you can see in the very first video posted on this channel, How to Think Critically About the U.S. Constitution. Now, going on, we now look at what do you do to deal with the fact that most of the representatives now sit in their seats for decades. That was not how the system was intended, especially when you now have only 435 people in the House. It's been like that for over 100 years, and you have over 330 million people living in the country. That's not extending the sphere of representation. And so what you want to do to counter the effects of the tendency of incumbents to keep their office is you want to eliminate political gerrymandering. The Supreme Court just needs a standard. Congress won't provide a standard because, as we have stated earlier, we assume that those in power will not give up power. And so it doesn't matter whether it's Democrats in power or Republicans in power. If it's Congress in power, they're not going to want to give up their power back to the people. So the only way you're going to get this done is to go into an Article 5 convention of the people. The third idea, which goes along with eliminating gerrymandering, is to somehow limit spending in the elections, possibly public financed elections, some way that all interest can be heard rather than the interest of the wealthy just sort of blanketing the airwaves in the 2 or 3 months before every election. For the Senate, 2 obvious fixes come up, 2 things that maybe should have been done at the time of the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment transferred who chooses senators from the state legislatures to elections by the people. Part of the reason for that was we have a guarantee of a Republican form of government in Article 4 of the Constitution. Some of the states were failing to send senators to Congress at all, and so those states did not have representation in the Senate. That failed to meet the guarantee. The only solution was to change how they were selected from the state legislatures to the people, which was a very popular thing to do. However, they continue to have their 6-year terms instead of reducing them to 4 or 2-year terms. Whenever you have elections by the people, the principle that goes with that is frequent elections. And why that wasn't done is not clear, other than probably some people knew about Madison's notes or just that general viewpoint of trying to protect the Constitution to protect the rich. And you see that vein going throughout our history. So, in addition to that, you add more senators from each state. That extends the sphere of representation. You get better representation for more people. Just 2 senators, obviously, that favors the wealthy. So you could easily increase from 100 to 250 in the Senate. Note also, with only 100 senators, 51 of those would be a majority. You now have individuals in our society that have over $100 billion of wealth. They could dangle $50 million in front of 51 senators and own the Senate. That's way too small. We have to look at ways to change that. Maybe one of the best fixes we could have would be to change who chooses the Supreme Court. And I don't propose that you have elections by the people, because the people generally are not well educated enough to know how to choose. However, you could still have a system where the people elect people to choose for them rather than just one person. When you have just one person, that causes these sort of radical bounces back and forth through history when the Supreme Court ends up becoming somewhat political during certain periods. You could have a lot more justices on the Supreme Court, and that would be consistent with extending the sphere of representation, the concept of Madison in Federalist Number 10. And if you have them elected by, say, a body like the third division of a tricameral system, where you have maybe about 13,000 people in the country able to elect the justices, they would have enough educational ability to know how to elect good justices, and hopefully you'd get more middle-of-the-road justices rather than these sort of extreme justices on both ends of the political spectrum. So that's one way to reduce that problem. The other thing is possibly term limits, if it doesn't interfere with the court's independence from the other 2 branches. With respect to making the president more representative of the American people, we can certainly talk about the electoral college system, but I want to talk about something maybe more fundamental in the foundation of our system, where you can actually shift power from our current executive branch, which has actually exploded in terms of having an unelected administrative system, and shift some management over that unelected administrative system under elected officials in our new tricameral legislative system, where the third level of a legislating system could handle approving the various administrative rules, so that you actually have elected officials connected to the people making those rules. This would take power away from the president, and I think would be consistent with the theory of free government, that you extend the sphere of representation for everybody's safety. It's, you'd have to test it out and see how things go, obviously, but theoretically it should work better. The other thing would be to shift power from the national government to state governments generally, but it has to be done without putting the union at risk, and there's a lot to talk about there. So we're going to close out and talk about how we can make our system of representation more representative of the American people. And going back to the fourth slide in this PowerPoint presentation, James Madison had written that if you extend the right of suffrage equally to all, the rights of property may be overruled by a majority without property, particularly in the laws impairing the obligation of contracts. He uses this as justification for actually unbalancing the representation system in favor of the wealthy and against workers. But there does not seem to be a need to do that. Those with property are already protected in the text of the U.S. Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution provides that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts, and our Fifth Amendment at the end, the last two clauses state that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The conclusion to be drawn is that there is no justification to have an unbalanced representation system in favor of the rich. James Madison made original promises at the time of the ratification of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, numbers 55, 56, and 58, that representation would continue to increase in the House so that all interests are meaningfully represented. And we have not added any representatives in the House for over 100 years, so that promise was broken. The 1821 notes of Madison appear to be some justification for the failures. We know one thing, that there is no justification to give the rich more representation rights, either as to voting or as to having too small of a Senate or too small of a House to be able to represent all interests. Individual rights should be protected in the Bill of Rights, not in the representation system. In the theory of free government, we assume that those in power will not give it up. And so there's only one peaceful path provided in the U.S. Constitution to amend our system of representation, and that is the Article 5 Convention of the People for proposing constitutional amendments. And as John Marshall said in the famous McCulloch versus Maryland case in 1819, the Constitution was submitted to the people. They acted upon it in the only manner in which they can act safely, effectively, and wisely on such a subject, by assembling in convention. In the first video on this channel, How to Think Critically About the U.S. Constitution, I introduced this matrix, a proposed model rule for Article 5 conventions. This will help guide the people going into the convention, and this will help people to think about how to make the Constitution less aristocratic and more democratic. Here's a partial list of the free civics education videos on this channel. I invite you all to take a look. For further study, I invite you to take a look at my book, Guide to the First Article 5 Convention of the People.